Have you been eating your breakfast and thought, is this the right thing for me to be eating? Cereal? Really? Especially before exercise. Even if you haven't thought about that, this video is probably going to be quite interesting because you should probably get rid of the cereal. To make this video, I was using the Supersapiens continuous blood glucose monitor to measure my blood glucose levels. And I tested 4 different breakfasts to see what happens to my blood sugar levels when I have them. At the end of the video, I'm going to go over why these responses from the body are important. Let's start with the one from the introduction, cereal. Cereal is basically pure sugar and fiber. And one thing that really bugs me is that they try and advertise this as healthy. It's insane. But as I'm about to show you now, it is by far the worst of all the breakfasts that I have. The cereal that I was eating for this test were these Choco Hazelnut Pillows from Lidl. And I chose these ones because if I'm just going to be having nutritionless nonsense, it might as well at least taste good. So first breakfast here, generally what we're looking for is to avoid peaks and spikes. As you can see here, the first time I had the cereal, I spiked all the way up to 127 milligrams. And then it had a really big and fast drop off down to kind of around the 60 mark. So this was the first day. The second day gets worse. I spike all the way at 149 milligrams and it has a really big drop off. Not so low on the drop off this time, but it has a really big one. Then finally on the third day, I had an even bigger response. I had 174 milligrams, a massive spike in the body here, and then a massive drop off again, all the way down to about 60 milligrams again. So really big fluctuations in the cereal here. I'm going to go over why that's so important later. For my second breakfast, I went for completely the opposite. I went for a pretty much 0 carbohydrate breakfast. And for this, I used a chia pudding. Within the chia pudding, I also put flaxseed, so you also get more fats in there from that. And I used an almond milk purely because that has very low sugars in it. Finally, to give this one some flavor, I put a massive dollop of almond butter over the top. And once again, it's just almonds, so there really is hardly any sugar in there at all. As you can see here, from the first day of having it, I only spiked at 104 milligrams, so definitely a lot lower than even the first breakfast, which was the lowest one. Secondly, there was hardly any drop off afterwards. I didn't really drop below 70 much. On the second day that I had it, you could barely even tell that it's there in the graph. I peaked at 90 milligrams. It was even higher before I had the breakfast. This second day, however, you can probably see that it was manipulated a little bit by doing some cycling beforehand. So that will reduce the spike in blood sugars. And then finally the third day, my final spike, it only went up to 99 milligrams. Same again, hardly any drop off at all. After having the breakfast, it doesn't really drop very low at all. So for this breakfast, in terms of keeping your blood glucose levels fairly stable, I think this is a very good breakfast for that. And of course, the reason is obvious. There's hardly any carbohydrates or sugars at all in this breakfast. For my breakfast number 3, I was doing overnight oats. So same again, I just used some almond milk in some oats and left it overnight. Much more carbohydrates in this one because you are using oats compared to the chia pudding. For this one, it's quite a plain breakfast. So just to make it taste better, I put a dollop of yogurt on top just to add some extra flavor and enjoyment into it. But let's have a look at the responses. And well, as you can see here, day 1, it almost looks like the chia puddings. Like there's hardly any response. I peaked at 94, there's no dip afterwards. It remains fairly flat the whole time. Day 2, I did actually have a larger response. I went up to 116. I did have a dip afterwards, but it didn't dip very low and was starting to come up quickly after that. So it did show some glucose response, but not a big spiky one like the cereal did. And then finally, day 3, looking fairly similar to day 2. 116 milligrams it went up to. Same again, it did have a dip as well, but then very quickly came back up. This did get me questioning though. I was like, how much of this response is coming from the yogurt itself? Because there are sugars in yogurt to make sure it tastes nice. So I did 2 more breakfasts on the overnight oats and I added extra yogurt. So I made sure there was a massive dollop of yogurt on there. It tasted good, but let's see what happens to the bloods. And as you can see, this is the highest response yet from the overnight oats. I went all the way up to 118. And then finally, the second day with the overnight oats, it went all the way up to 122. And then we had a big drop off all the way down to 61 milligrams. So what I think I'm seeing here is that the yogurt is really the big impactor in this breakfast rather than the overnight oats. So I think from now on, when I do have this cereal, I'll probably have less yogurt, more oats. I do have one more breakfast for us to go through, and that is eggs on toast. A nice simple one, some good protein in there, but I did want to see what happened with the bread. Also, to make this meal a bit more flavoursome, I did use a tomato pesto on top there. I did actually find these results the most interesting of all four, and the reason why I think this is happening is because the protein from the eggs is slowing the digestion of the carbohydrates. But let's have a look. So day one, I actually only peaked at 97 milligrams, so it wasn't a very high peak on this one. But one thing I did start to notice was actually the drop-offs. And on the first day, I dropped off all the way down to 58. So for a not very high peak, I think it's quite a strong drop-off. So the body is releasing insulin even without the high peak on this one. Then if we go on to my second day, a bit stronger of a response. I went all the way up to 108, but I had a massive drop off all the way down below 55 milligrams. And actually for this one, it looked to stay low for quite a long time, a lot longer than it normally does. And then finally, the last day that I had a different response again, but similar trend as a whole. I peaked at 85, so once again, not a very high peak, but then I did drop off below 55 milligrams again. And for me, I believe this one is happening purely because of the bread. Just like cereal is, bread isn't a very nutritious food. It's pretty much like a lot of sugar, a lot of fiber. And when people are trying to do things such as lose body fat mass, the first thing they get told is to cut out the bread. And I think it's because you see these high insulin responses to the bread. So all of this data, you know, it's great and all, but what does it all mean? So to begin with, spikes are generally a bad thing, as your body will want to release insulin to bring those blood sugar levels down quickly. When we talk of this from an exercise performance perspective, the spike followed by a drop will decrease your exercise performance as well, as now your body is trying to store that glucose rather than utilize that glucose. And over time, over many training sessions, this starts to have an increased and accumulative impact on your training performance, as well as during competition performance. And this can go for any sport. This can go for cycling, swimming, running, football, rugby, golf maybe. But whatever you want it to be, this will impact it. Also, while speaking to Supersapiens, they did tell me the more spikes you see during the day before a big event or a race that you have, the more spiky your race data is going to be as well, which will decrease your performance. And this also goes for the meal and nutrition you have right before the event as well, so your breakfast, for example. So ideally, we want to see generally a flatter graph as we go through the day. Your body isn't a machine though, so it's never going to keep that perfect. There's always going to be lots of up and downs, but the idea is to make sure those ups and downs aren't too big and you've generally got a flatter curve going throughout the day. It's more about if the overall trend is flat without any big mountains in there. Doing this testing has actually taught me a lot about myself as well. So generally, I think I'm going to stick to the overnight oats, especially if I'm having a training day that day or I'm having a big race. I think the overnight oats are going to give me the best response that I can get for those events, whilst giving me the carbohydrates to actually fuel for that event. But I'll keep the yogurt down though. Combined with that, with days that I'm not going to be training, I'm probably going to have the chia puddings. One, because I really like these, and secondly, the most important reason is that it keeps my glucose levels super flat. The other two, the cereal, has definitely got to go. That is a no-go in my diet now. And the eggs on toast, I never really had it much anyway, but it was an interesting test, and now I can see that the bread actually did not sit with me very well. Even though I didn't feel like it was, the data was suggesting otherwise. One final thing to note is that these are my own personal responses. Your personal responses might be different to mine, as everybody's body reacts differently. And with that, I'm just going to close off. If you found this video interesting or helpful for you, and maybe it gave you something, please give it a like for me, as this might help other people find the video that it might help for as well. If you have any questions or have any additional information that you would like to share, or even any sciencey knowledge that people can dig their teeth into, please share it below, because I like to read it as well. If you're interested and want to go deeper into the science of Supersapiens, then over here, I have a video where I go into a deeper chat with one of the head scientists at Supersapiens, and we look at my blood glucose data as we go through the Mallorca 312 event, and I ask him lots of very interesting questions. So feel free to click on that one. I'll see you in the next video.